Waiting. My name is Erica Spade-Patras, and I'm with the Greater Ohio Policy Center in Columbus, Ohio. As many of you know, we are a research and advocacy nonprofit with a vision of a revitalized Ohio. Today, we are hosting the third webinar in a four-part series entitled Keeping People in Their Homes, which focuses on strategies for neighborhood stability, particularly in the time of COVID. Greater Ohio has organized this series in partnership with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, so we thank them for their partnership in this effort. As I mentioned, this webinar series addresses themes of neighborhood stability, and each week we've focused on strategies that different actors can implement. In the last 2 weeks, we've touched on the role that philanthropy and mission-driven developers can play in responding to COVID. And next week, we will be focusing on local government strategies. Today's webinar is entitled Rental Protection Legislation for Local Governments, and it will focus on several ordinances communities have recently adopted to protect renters. Before we get started on the program and I introduce our moderator, I want to hit on a few housekeeping items. First of all, we have reserved 3 to 4 minutes for your questions after each presentation. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll see that those get to our presenters. Also, we recommend that you watch this webinar in the speaker view. That way you'll have the fewest distractions. And finally, we are recording the webinar and you'll be able to find it on our website at greaterohio.org later this week. So with that, I am happy to introduce today's moderator, Robert Killens Jr. Robert is the Director of Special Initiatives at Greater Cincinnati Foundation, where he attracts and stewards donors for the foundation. He also supports Greater Cincinnati Foundation's private foundation work and manages a $10 million impact investment program. Robert also represents the foundation in a multi-sectoral partnership working to develop a community-wide housing strategy for Cincinnati. Prior to his work with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, Robert had a 24-year career at the Procter & Gamble Company, P&G. Robert also has significant nonprofit experience as a volunteer, founder, board member, and board chair of several Cincinnati, Ohio-based nonprofits. Welcome, Robert. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Erica. I would like to get us started straight away. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you today our very first presenter. Our very first presenter today is Deborah Levy. Deborah is a senior attorney for Advocates for Basic Legal Equality in Dayton, Ohio. It's a nonprofit regional law firm that provides high-quality legal assistance in civil matters to help eligible low-income individuals and groups in Western Ohio achieve self-reliance, equal justice, and economic opportunity. Deborah has spent her legal career serving low-income individuals and groups. She has served as counsel in a variety of litigation aimed at preserving public and subsidized housing, enforcing fair housing laws, and protecting the housing rights of tenants. Deborah's here to share information about 2 new ordinances in Dayton, Ohio, that are designed to promote housing stability for tenants. Welcome, Deborah.
Thanks, Robert. It's good to be here, and it's good to be here with all of you virtually. I'm going to talk today about 2 ordinances that were passed in Dayton last year. The 2 are the rent receipt and late fee ordinances. They were passed in June of 2020, and they were the result of work done by the Eviction Task Force that was developed by Mayor Nan Whaley in Dayton, Ohio. Next slide, please. The Dayton rent receipt ordinance, this ordinance came about because there are many of our clients, low-income clients who are unbanked, who would pay their rent either by cash or money order. And that would create problems for the tenants because they wouldn't get a receipt. So this ordinance requires that the landlord provide tenants with a signed rent receipt for payments that are made by cash or money order. Next slide. Many times in eviction court, we would find that tenants would show up, they would testify that they had paid their rent, the landlord would deny that they had paid their rent, but they wouldn't have a rent receipt. So this ordinance shifts the burden. What it indicates is that if the landlord fails to provide a rent receipt to the tenant, and the tenant's paid by cash or money order, and the landlord then files an eviction case, the landlord then has to prove that the rent was not paid. Next slide, please. The second ordinance is a late fee ordinance. This ordinance prohibits landlords from charging interest on a late fee or imposing a late fee more than one time on a single rent payment. Next slide. The late fee that the landlord charges can't exceed the larger of $25 or 5% of the monthly contract rent. Now I open the floor up to questions.
Okay, so while we wait for other questions to come into the chat. So Deborah, can you tell us what has been the impact of these ordinances so far on low-income renters?
Yeah, so these ordinances, as I mentioned, they passed in June of 2020, shortly after we were beginning to deal with the pandemic. What we have seen is that the late fee ordinance has been a godsend for rental assistance. So particularly in Dayton, the Miami Valley Community Action Partnership provides the bulk of the rental assistance. And with this new ordinance, they've been able to stretch the rental assistance dollars farther than they would have been able to do without it. So they've been able to educate landlords on the cap, and they've been able to pay less money towards late fees. So it's had a huge.
You can put Abby's back up here.
Tenant.
That's not what we're. Danny was right.
Would everyone please mute?
I don't care. Just get in the car.
With everyone on the call, if you're not speaking as the speaker, please mute. Okay, thank you, Deborah. I'll see if I'm able to mute. I'll try to do that. Thank you. Deborah, were you finished with that answer? My apologies.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yes, I was finished with that answer.
Okay, so we've had a few more questions come, but let me first ask, how was the 5% determined as the cap on the late fee?
So we looked at other ordinances throughout the state. So Cincinnati, Cleveland also have comparable ordinances, and we felt that the 5% was a fair amount. And so the Dayton ordinance was modeled after those ordinances.
Excellent. Was the pushback from the landlords about implementing these two pieces of legislation?
Surprisingly, there was pushback about the rent receipt ordinance and the cost of providing receipts to tenants, but that pushback has died down. So we're thankful that the ordinance passed and that it will provide protections, particularly for low-income tenants, knowing that they will have proof of their rent payments.
Excellent. In terms of the coverage with these ordinances, can you have a sense of how many communities have them, and is there, the follow-up part of the question, is there a reason to believe that a statewide or a state level piece of legislation could be passed?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's my understanding that Cincinnati and Cleveland both have similar ordinances. I believe that Toledo recently passed a late fee ordinance as well. And so it's great to see that we have these ordinances throughout the state. You know, it's been difficult to tackle housing protection statewide in Ohio for tenants. So I don't want to say that it's never a possibility, but it has been challenging to try to enact legislation statewide that would protect tenants.
Okay, I think those are the key questions. So, Deborah, thank you. Your presentation was to the point. Maybe one final question before you go. What do you see next happening, or what has now that these have implemented? Do you see the need for something additional that wasn't anticipated that now has arisen with these ordinances that you want to implement to protect renters further?
We have been working on trying to enact pay to stay. So that's separate and apart from a late fee or a rent receipt ordinance that passed in the village of Yellow Springs around the same time last year, and recently passed in the city of Toledo at the end of last year. So that's something that we've been working on as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for the questions that you provided. Here's one final one, since we have time. This will be the last one. Does the city of Dayton have a rental registration or a landlord licensing system? That was the last question we'll take.
Dayton does have a rental registration system.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you immensely, Deborah. We know you have to leave to go and defend some nice folks in court. So we know that you won't be able to stay for the Q&A. So thank you for your leadership and everything you're doing there in the city of Dayton and in the fair housing realm. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Now we are going to move to our second presenter today. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to each of you Amy Clayman. Let me tell you a little bit about Amy. Amy spearheaded and then became the co-founder and project facilitator for Move to Prosper. It's an initiative of the Ohio State University and community partners to improve life outcomes for children and their mothers by creating opportunities for residential and financial stability through temporary rental support and through comprehensive coaching. This coaching facilitates successful moves to higher resourced and safe communities. Prior to her work with Move to Prosper, Amy was the president and CEO of Homeport. And there she led all aspects of this large, multifaceted nonprofit organization that provides service-enriched rental housing. It revitalizes neighborhoods and helps people to become and remain successful homeowners. Through her work at Move to Prosper, Amy saw the need to create more equitable and diverse communities. This led to working with others to create a group called Building Welcoming Communities. And this was done to protect people from discrimination based on their source of income. Today, Amy will talk about her efforts to have source of income protection ordinances adopted by city councils throughout Central Ohio. Let's welcome Amy.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you to the Greater Ohio Policy Center for organizing today's program. And thank you as well to all of you who are on the attending today's program. Today's topic is keeping people in their homes. it is very important that we keep people in their homes, but it is also very important that we address the structural issues and barriers that prevent renters from having a choice of living where they'd like to live throughout the region. So source of income discrimination is when a landlord refuses to rent a unit to a prospective tenant based on their source of income. And go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So source of income discrimination, it perpetuates poverty and systemic racism because landlords are given the right to say, I don't want your income, even though it's a valid source of money to pay the rent. To give you a sense of the issue here in Central Ohio, although I do know that not everybody who's participating today is here in Columbus or the Central Ohio region, but here, 3 in 5 Columbus housing voucher holders live in neighborhoods with a poverty rate above 10%. And in Franklin County, most of the vouchers are used in Columbus. Most are held by people who are of Black or people of color, and 50% are disabled. And you can see on the map on the bottom right-hand side where most of the vouchers are being used. This is similar to a redlining map when you compare the different maps. So next slide, please. So a source of income ordinance prevents a landlord from refusing to rent to individuals based on the type of income that they're using. The ordinance would define source of income. We started with the model rules or model legislation that the Poverty and Race Research Action Council has suggested, and it's been updated a little bit based on what we've seen in other municipalities. And it's basically requires a landlord to take income from wages, investment, trusts, child support, spousal support, grants or loan programs, all forms of federal, state, or local assistance payments, benefits, or subsidy payments. So it's not just housing vouchers, but a much broader definition of that. And the people who are most affected by this are veterans. They may be paying their rent through BASH certificates, people with disabilities who receive SSI, families with children who may have a housing choice voucher, people who are divorced who are getting spousal support or child support. So these are examples. And that's why this is so important, because this is income, and we believe it is so important that it be included and not just allow landlords to say, nope, we don't want your income. Next slide, please. So the impact on the renters when a municipality adopts a source of income protection law, it reduces discrimination. It allows for source of income to be a protected class, or it could be part of a discrimination code. So either it's amending fair housing law to include source of income, or a discrimination provision prohibiting discrimination based on your source of income. It provides opportunity to tenants to look throughout the region or throughout the city to find housing that meets their needs, rather than having all people with, whether it's vouchers or other sources of income, congregating in parts of a city. We're very involved on this because there's a lot of research that shows the benefits to families when children are able to live in higher resourced neighborhoods. And it is in those neighborhoods where they would have access to better resourced schools, parents have access to jobs, pay a higher wage, healthy surroundings that people don't have access to, because it's in those areas that landlords are generally not accepting alternative source of income from employment. So this provides more affordable housing in that it opens up doors to affordable housing in areas that don't currently have affordable housing. Next slide, please. So what are the impact on the landlords? The landlord maintains their right to screen and deny housing to those who do not meet eligibility criteria. They are allowed to charge security deposits. They accept nothing less than their market rent, and they may seek damages if the tenant causes some type of problem with the unit, because these are the kinds of questions we've had. And so I want to make sure that people understand landlords still do have the right to file a lawsuit if that's needed. The new obligation under this ordinance is that landlord would have to comply with inspections, and they would need to complete 2 documents, a tenancy addendum and a housing assistance plan contract, the HAP contract. They would work with if the source of income is a voucher, they would then work with the housing authority. And these additional inspection requirements are only if they are paying rent through a housing voucher. Obviously, this doesn't come into play if somebody's alternative source of income is child support or spousal support. Next one, please. So source of income ordinances have been adopted throughout the country. There are 18 states, it's possible it's 19. This has been a very active issue throughout the country. 99 cities and the District of Columbia have already adopted these ordinances. Very recently, the city of Bexley and Westerville here in central Ohio adopted this type of protection. Other cities throughout the state, many in the Cleveland area and Cincinnati, have already adopted this protection. Volunteers with Building Welcoming Communities are right now working with policymakers in three or four other municipalities here in central Ohio. More than half of all nationwide voucher holders are living in cities with source of income protections. And what's very, very important is that HUD has found that cities with source of income protections have reduced denial rates when people go in to apply for housing. So in cities without this protection, there's a 78% denial rate. In cities with this protection, a 15% denial rate. So this is very meaningful change for people that hold some type of housing voucher. So we like to always include in our presentations, why are people against this? First of all, what we'll hear is, well, when people have housing assistance, they're more likely to damage their rental unit. That's what people say. It's a myth. It's not true. People of all different incomes may, in fact, cause damage to a unit. And in fact, people with housing assistance are incentivized not to harm their unit because they are at risk of losing their voucher. Some people are just NIMBYs, not in my backyard. They just don't want, quote, those people, end quote, in their community. Basis of this kind of comment is racism. Just have to call out what it is. The landlord community is very vocal, or has been vocal against this. They don't like to be required to participate in a bureaucratic program. They say it's not right to require that. And our response is, when you own a business, you have to participate in many different government programs, and this is one of them. And not discriminating is more important than not being required to sign a couple of contracts. Next one, please. So how do you go about adopting this type of protection in your community? If you're listening in today and you're an advocate for change, first thing is educate yourself about this issue, talk to your friends, family, broader community, so you get together a group of people. We started building welcoming communities with 3 people, and now there's just little groups of 5 people approximately in different cities that we're working in, and then they talk to their friends. Call your city council members or a mayor or city staff, find an advocate. Coordinate letter writing campaigns, assist the public official in determining the strategy. Find a landlord who supports this type of legislation. That is a type of person will be an important advocate to have on your side. And if possible, find somebody who's an expert in navigating HUD regulations and working with the housing authority. Hopefully your housing authority would support this and be available to answer questions. Then you go about developing your strategy, talking to council members, attending the meetings, and very importantly, after passage, tell the media and thank your council members. So hopefully you're inspired to work together with people in your community to adopt this type of ordinance. If you work with a member of a city staff, you can bring this up with your council members and get this on the agenda. I saw a question in the chat about raising rents. I think the question, let's see. I think the that question goes to, will landlords raise their rents? Some people are concerned that if you raise this issue, landlords will just raise their rent to get around it. You know, rents are determined by market. And so they can't just go ahead and raise it as much as they want because they don't want to participate. Yes, some landlords may decide to renovate their properties as a means of getting more rent. Hopefully landlords will do the right thing. Once they accept their first voucher, if that's the source of income that they're concerned with, they'll see that it's not so tough to participate in this program. There was another question in the chat about having this addressed by the state legislature. So you have a statewide protection. What I've seen in other states is that you first get a lot of cities to adopt it before the state does. And quite frankly, I would be concerned today bringing this to our state legislature. We would not want to see the legislature going the other way and prohibiting cities from adopting this type of protection. So our strategy has been go city by city to get the protections needed. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Amy. You've dealt with a couple of questions, but we've got a few more. So one question was, you sort of addressed it, but about the statewide, but there was a question about, is there any regional coordination, you know, in terms of regions to maybe collectively work on either model legislation or something like that? Are you aware of anything like that?
I know in Cleveland, there's a group in Cleveland. I saw that Emily Lungard with Enterprise was on the call, and they work together regionally to adopt this type of legislation. They're working to get the county to adopt it. Here in Central Ohio, I've been told that that Franklin County is not eligible to pass this type of ordinance. So we're going city by city. And one thing that I have found is that Some cities are addressing this through their fair housing code, others by just, and they don't have a fair housing code, so they do it as a discrimination code. And some cities have neither. And so we just encountered that. I'm hoping that we have a conversation with the city attorney to figure out the strategy. So there's not going to be a one size fits all. What we are striving for, though, is that the definition of source of income be similar, with some tweaks, because as we're learning, we are tweaking the definition. But that generally we try to have that similar as we're going to different municipalities throughout the region.
All right, that's good. So some questions about the nitty gritty. What issues have come up as you've been working with these different municipalities? I'm sure there have been a range of them, but are there 3 or 4 that are common that you encounter when municipalities start to work on these?
Yes, there are common questions. One deals with the landlords. So the first city that we worked in was Bexley, and Landlord Association, the Columbus Realtors and another group approached the mayor and the president of city council to discuss their opposition to the ordinance. And the mayor and president of city council invited me and my colleague, Rachel Cleet, to join the meeting and had a discussion. So be prepared for opposition from the landlord community. They don't want any regulations. And so in terms of strategy, try to find somebody, a landlord who is accepting Section 8, a housing choice voucher, to be on your side. The other opposition that we've seen is towards the paperwork. So need to understand how the process works, having an advocate who knows how the tenants and landlords work through the process of getting approved, working with the housing authority. So you have somebody who can answer those kinds of questions is important, because that comes up is exactly how does this work and what are the barriers. Trying to think of other things that have come up. It's mainly with the landlord side. You know, when we're working in some of the higher resourced areas, the opposition we get is, well, the rents here are just too high, and so we don't need to pass something like this because it doesn't really affect anybody. And our response is, well, it does affect people who are divorced and have other sources of income, for example, and housing authorities, you know, do have some leeway in terms of how much their rent can be. And they don't, you know, unless there's a rental registry and the city clearly knows everybody renting and what the rents are, they don't know for sure if there are landlords who really could be part of this. So we feel that it's just important to get it on the books to show that it's a welcoming community.
Thank you. Those are great great responses. So so Amy, how does one first of all find, or is there some magic to locating a city council member that's willing to introduce the ordinance? And then secondly, is there a strategy once you have that to working with them? So how does one get started by finding a legislator that's amenable?
So let's see. If you don't know your city council members or your mayor, do a little research, see what they've introduced before. And you could, if you know staff, talk to the staff in this building department or zoning or city relations, and see if you can get some information. But you can just call your council members and ask to meet with them and discuss this and see if you can find an advocate. So that's how it started in Bexley. Just had a conversation. It came up with the mayor. The mayor got the issue. Then we met with city council president. And together we developed this strategy. And when I say strategy, that is who should we contact? The city council member that's your advocate can help pave the way by talking to his or her colleagues. They can help coordinate some meetings with others. So the president of the Bexley City Council reached out to a member of another city council, and we just met. So you can ask for help in that way. And that opened a door to another municipality. Hopefully, my fingers are crossed, that will now meet with the law director of this other city. I've just sent letters to council members and supporting this issue. That resulted in meeting in another municipality. So, if you support it, you just cold call people, find people who are tend to be progressive and want to have a welcoming community. And that's how we broach this. Do you want your children to grow up with the richness of the diversity of our region? And that's income, it's race, it's ethnicity, always. And if so, this is an important step in making change. And
that's
supportive.
No, that's good. That's good. Thank you. So we're gonna stop there.
Okay.
Thank you, Amy, and we'll have more questions, at the end. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a few more questions, but we'll get them at the end. So our presenter, it's my pleasure to introduce Abigail Stout. Abigail is the managing attorney for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland and leads the housing practice group. Abby is also the co-chair of the advisory board, of the Office of Homeless Services. Her practice includes representing tenants at risk of losing access to their subsidized or in private housing and improving housing policies. Currently, much of Abby's work is focused on lead poisoning prevention and the development of a program to provide a right to civil counsel in eviction cases under Cleveland's newly passed right to counsel legislation. Amy is going to share more about this legislation with us today. So let's welcome Abby.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Robert. And thank you to the Greater Ohio Policy Center for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk today about the right to counsel in Cleveland. It launched on July 1st, and so we have actually some outcomes to share with you today as well. Can I have the next slide, please? The Legal Aid Society is our mission. We're a nonprofit law firm, and our mission is to secure justice and fundamental problems for those who are low income and vulnerable by providing high quality legal services and working for systemic solutions. We serve in Northeast Ohio, covering 5 counties from Lorain to Ashtabula. Next slide, please. So what is the right to counsel movement? You all, I'm sure, are familiar with the message, you have a right to an attorney. We've all heard it in criminal shows. It's something that's part of our day-to-day speech. But what does that actually mean? It actually only applies to criminal cases. And so the whole civil side of cases do not have necessarily a right to counsel. So there's a movement to provide, in certain situations where there are basic human needs that are at risk, a right to have an attorney represent you. We see it in housing cases, we see it in immigration cases, in parental custody cases, those types of things. We really see it as preventative legal medicine. It's a way to address societal issues instead of having people go it alone and expecting that they know the law and how to defend themselves, but having somebody who's an expert, a doctor, to help them fix their problem. We think of it as a right, not looking at having just a program to provide extra legal representation, but to affect systemic actors by making a change going forward to entitle people with representation. It's full legal representation. So we're talking about not just a lawyer for a day showing up, but somebody an attorney who's assigned to a case as soon as they get it and sees it through its very end, which results in better outcomes. It also provides equity in the hearings and faith in the proceedings. Tenants are less likely to walk away thinking they weren't heard and that they didn't know what they were doing and they didn't know what their rights were. And oftentimes tenants are standing there next to their landlord who is represented by an attorney. And there's long-term financial benefits to providing counsel for tenants. One, oftentimes we're able to assist tenants in staying in their homes and paying their rent going forward. So it avoids turnover fees. But we also see greater social outcomes like fewer shelter stays, shorter hospital stays, and less interaction with the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. The right to counsel was first sort of launched in New York City in 2017. They passed a historic right to counsel legislation that provided counsel for all tenants under 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. After 1 year, they saw that 84% of people who had counsel were able to avoid displacement, and that eviction filings dropped by 34%. And this is pre-COVID. San Francisco followed shortly after, and Philadelphia was on its road to starting a right to counsel. Next slide, please. So Legal Aid in 2017 established the Housing Justice Alliance. A local foundation, the Sisters of Charity, launched a fellowship program to incubate innovative ideas to address a poverty issue in Cleveland. And we had a fellow, Hazel Remish, who submitted an application to explore the idea of right to counsel. It was an 18-month fellowship, and under that fellowship, as an organization supporting Hazel, we did a ton of networking with colleagues across the country who were running similar programs. We did site visits to New York City and to Washington, D.C. We advocated for the sealing of eviction records to lower some barriers to finding new housing. We formed an advisory committee that was made of stakeholders and policymakers. And we began fundraising both for the idea of a right to counsel and also for things like rent assistance to go alongside of it and for a research project. We commissioned a study with Case Western to look at the downstream costs of eviction. There was a lot of data out there, but we really wanted to tell our community what was happening in Cleveland. Next slide, please. So what we found was there's supposed to be a picture of a mom and two children in that circle, but it didn't show up. What we found was that in Cleveland, we already knew that there were about 9,000 evictions every year. And the study showed us that those who are evicted are usually African-American, they're usually women, and there's usually children in the household. Their monthly rent is about $1,200, and a significant number, 30%, had a previous eviction filing. And most filings were for non-payment of rent, and the total arrears was about that monthly rent, about $1,200. Next slide, please. Case Western's report also showed sort of they highlighted 5 impacts of eviction, that mobility increases. And this means that families tend to move a lot more after they've had an eviction. The neighborhood quality, where there have been a lot of evictions, goes down. And often those who have been evicted move to a neighborhood that has fewer resources. Homeless shelter use increases. I think that would be expected. And school attendance for children decreases. And then we also see that lead exposure. Fewer children are actually tested when there's been an eviction in the household, and those who have been tested tend to have higher numbers of elevated blood lead levels. Next slide, please. So with this momentum and engaging some council people, just as Amy had talked about in the source of income presentation, we were able to pass, the City of Cleveland passed an ordinance on October 1st, 2019, that guarantees a right to counsel for evictions for certain tenants. Tenants who are eligible are facing eviction and have at least 1 child in the household, and they're at 100% or below of the federal poverty guideline. So that's about an annual income of $21,000. And the right guarantees full representation at the housing court in Cleveland. There's a partnership that's formed between United Way and Legal Aid, where United Way runs sort of the programming, the evaluation, and the outreach, and Legal Aid provides legal representation. And then tenants also may be eligible for emergency financial assistance. And that's something that has been really helpful with the right to counsel. Next slide, please. The right became effective on July 1st. This slide shows the case flow. So if you'll see from the left side of the slide, the case starts when the landlord files an eviction. United Way, working with Legal Aid, does a fair amount of outreach. A letter goes out in the summons, and then a separate letter is sent to all defendants who have an eviction filed against them. Then from that, the tenant will either contact Legal Aid and we'll do an intake and figure out if they're eligible. Then the case is assigned and worked up with a full representation. And that is done either by staff attorneys, volunteer attorneys, or contract attorneys. If the tenant does not reach out to us before their hearing, Legal Aid will have staff on every docket, and they, with the court's assistance, will screen those who have children in the household to see if they might be eligible. And if they are, then the case is continued, and then they're sent to our intake where they're assigned to an attorney. We hired a bunch of attorneys during the pandemic and trained them in what we call the RTC boot camp in June of 2020. So they were ready to go on July 1st. Next slide, please. Our outreach includes all of these various methods. It's obviously been a little bit hampered because of the pandemic. We've had to pivot quite a bit. We can't do as many presentations in person and outreach in community centers, but what we have done is created a website. As I said, there's a flyer that's put in every summons. There's an outreach letter sent to every defendant who has an eviction case against them. We've worked with the Democratic Socialists of America. They've knocked on 1,700 doors of people who have evictions filed against them. They give them our information about rent assistance, and then a whole host of various other methods to let people know about this right. Next slide, please. What does direct services mean? So for our team, we have a housing team that's representing people in all 5 counties for evictions. And then we have our right to counsel team, which consists of 8 attorneys, 2.5 supervising attorneys, 2 paralegals, intake specialists, some of our administration, and then our development and communications. These people are doing the work in order to provide the services to our clients. And what do the right to counsel attorneys do? They defend the eviction. They facilitate access to the court now that it's all on virtual, all virtual these days. We file counterclaims against the landlord. We seek repair to poor housing conditions at the rental premises. We facilitate rent assistance applications. We have a very close partnership with the organizations that are providing rent assistance, which began before the pandemic and continue on. And that has really helped a lot of people maintain their housing. And we provide social services from our own staff. And then also we do referrals to other organizations. And we do internal legal aid referrals. When we notice that there might be some other legal assistance that family may need, we will do a referral internally to another department in our agency. Next slide, please. And these are our outcomes for our first 6 months. We had about 323 cases, households where we provided representation. Many of them are still ongoing, especially with the moratorium, the CDC moratorium. Many of the cases have been stayed, so they're sort of halted in time, and they're not closed, but the families still are able to stay in their units, which is a positive outcome in its own. 1,600 people came to seek our services for eviction representation. It is actually 1,650. We weren't able to serve all of them. Some of them don't have children. Some of them don't have too much income. And for our outcomes, 93% of the cases that we've started and finished and closed, we were able to help those people avoid an eviction or an involuntary move. 83% of the cases, sometimes people do actually want to move, but they want more than 7 or 10 days. We've been able to get more than 30 days for 83% of our clients who are interested in moving. We've impacted over 700 children so far, and in particular of those cases that we've closed, it's been 133 children at this point. Next slide, please. And questions. So I saw some questions popping up, but I don't know, Robert, if you could help me because I wasn't able to catch them.
Sure. No, a lot of questions. So this last one that came up was, what's the funding source for your?
It's a public-private partnership, and so the funding comes. The city of Cleveland funds $300,000 per year towards the provision of legal services. And United Way provides part of the funding, and legal aid has raised quite a bit of money for the funding as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what has been the perspective of landlords on this issue? I mean, they have, to your point, 90+% of them show up with counsel.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think probably most didn't like the idea initially. It makes evictions harder to get done. But I do think that given the pandemic and the fact that when a client has an attorney through legal aid, we are able to facilitate the access to rent assistance pretty quickly and effectively, which is actually serving a need that many landlords need at this time. I mean, the reality is they might not be able to fill that unit with somebody else who has income because so many people are out of work due to the pandemic. So us helping to facilitate that rent is changing sort of the dynamic of how this is being accepted by landlords.
Okay, so it's maybe blunting a little bit of the opposition. Can I say that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And here's the other thing. There's only a handful of attorneys that are representing landlords, and we've worked with them for a long time. We've been in this field for forever. It's just now that we're handling a lot more people. So we've already established a lot of relationships and credibility amongst our opposing counsel, and so we are sometimes able to work out some difficult cases. Where normally the tenant would probably just be evicted.
Yeah. A question about the one final question, then we're going to open it up and make sure we bring back in Amy. what's the impact of the pandemic? I mean, I know it's been massive, but maybe can concisely share a couple of things.
Sure.
A couple ways the pandemic.
Yeah, you know, the impact, it's been really interesting. There have always been barriers to tenants attending their eviction trial. Before the pandemic, we saw probably 60% of people wouldn't even attend their eviction hearing. And now, and there were barriers like having to get to the Justice Center, having to park their car, finding childcare, having to miss work. Now it's really different because people are attending in their own homes. And the barriers are, do they have the right technology? Do they have the bandwidth in order to stay on a Zoom hearing for a couple hours? That kind of thing. Do they have the know-how to use Zoom? So it's been really different in terms of that. The other side is there's a lot more rent assistance. And so we're basically demonstrating how impactful rent assistance can be. Sometimes people just need a couple months worth of rent and then they're back working again already and they can pay their rent going forward. They just lost their job or were furloughed for a few months or 10 weeks or whatever amount of time, but are back working. And so I think what we're demonstrating is the effectiveness of rent assistance and of having counsel and keeping people stable and in their homes.
Okay, great. So Amy, we'll invite you to come back in. So this is a kind of a global question. It says, we've covered several types of ordinances today. Can you concisely both maybe address where would a community start with sort of looking at these different types? Where should they prioritize one over the other? How should they get started? So maybe you first, Abby, and then you, Amy.
Sure. I think any community that has a grassroots organizing, tenants organization is a great place to start. So either forming one or getting involved with a tenant organization. Many communities don't have them though. So for example, in Cleveland, our tenant organization dissolved a couple of years ago. And so it really does come down to people gathering and talking about what the most pressing issues are in their community. And right now there's a real push to address housing issues and children in Cleveland, both of these issues, both with sort of addressing lead poisoning and addressing keeping children in school and supporting the families that are in the public school system.
So Amy, we're going to give you the last word here before we turn it back over to Erica to close us out. What's your thoughts? Thank you for that, Abby.
So starting with an existing organization's great. If you can find an organization that backs this issue. We spoke to many different organizations and they all had their own agendas. And so a group of us is just volunteers who wanted to see more diversity within their neighborhoods and communities, got together to press this issue. And as you can tell, that 2 communities have already adopted it and others are looking at it. It's a good time to be raising this issue of bringing about inclusive communities that are equitable and open to all. So however you can go about getting people involved, we found that people who, have kids that want to see their communities be diverse and welcoming are involved. So, there's room for everybody to do everything, and the legislators and council members need to hear from us. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you both ladies. Thank you, Deborah, in her absence. Erica, it's to you to close us out. Thank you.
Hi, Robert. I think Erica was booted off just at the end of the webinar.
Okay, well,
tech problems happen, but this is Maria Walliser from the Greater Ohio Policy Center, willing to close it out. So as I see that we're closing it on 2 o'clock and we've wrapped up our questions here, I would just like to close by once again thanking everybody who has joined us today and to give a very hearty thank you to our panelists who shared really excellent perspectives and advice on how to deal with the challenges we're all facing in our communities. I also want to thank our partner, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, for their support in developing this series. As you'll see, everybody attending in the chat, there's a link to our survey. We would appreciate it if everybody would click on that link and fill out that survey just to reflect on your experience today on this webinar. And then please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have specific questions we were not able to get to today. Once again, this webinar has been recorded and will be archived on our website. We should have that available on our website by the end of the week. Next Tuesday's webinar was planned in partnership with the Center for Community Progress and is listed as local government programming to support neighborhood stability. We invite you to join us again then. Once again, thank you for coming today and goodbye.